This material was gathered from the files of Time magazine between roughly 1969 and 1972. A feeble attempt has been made to use also some stuff from recent issues to show that their policies have not changed since that time. One characteristic of Time since its founding in 1923 has been the incisive authoritarian tone of its prose, a tone which suggests conviction, people who know what they want. I hope to show that the editors often don't know what they want. They have convictions that reveal a good deal of mutual inconsistency among them. Despite some changes in style and attitudes, the editorial successors of Henry Luce continue to show his involvement with the ideal of a superstate built on industrial capitalism, welfare-oriented bureaucracy, organized technology, and military might. Yet they also continue to show a highly inconsistent, not to say contradictory, devotion to ideals associated with 19th century individualism, self-reliance, initiative, competitiveness, willpower, personal achievement. In promulgating this central confusion, I suppose Time both reflects and promotes a similarly schizoid tendency in American society as a whole. Marshall McLuhan says that because the phonetic alphabet induced man to freeze his thoughts in a set of arbitrary symbols and therefore to separate thought from action, schizophrenia may be a necessary consequence of literacy. With or without borrowing a dubious term from psychiatry, the careful reader of Time may trace in its pages a number of inconsistencies, even some contradictions between certain 19th century attitudes cherished by Time policymakers and a variety of 20th century developments, no less approved but hard to reconcile with the older values. In ways not always obvious, Time repeatedly attempts such reconciliations, usually at the cost of distorting or suppressing some of the conflicting elements. Two ways in which they attempt this reconciliation are personalizing the news and yet depersonalizing the individuals that they tie the stories to. And this is a subject and a half in itself. A second way, which is the main subject of this discussion, is a simultaneous emphasis on freedom and yet also on conformity. The Time obituary of Henry R. Luce, March 10, 1967, began with Luce's statement that, "As a journalist, I am in command of a small sector in the very front trenches of the battle for freedom." Luce's frequent carelessness with metaphor could be revealing. In this case, the idea of freedom is negated by the martial figure of speech. The passage is a small but significant example of how the contradiction between stress on images of authority and emphasis on traditional ideals of freedom and democracy has permeated the magazine. The contradiction is often resolved after a fashion by devitalizing the notion of freedom. The late Michael Hayter, board chairman of ESSO, was said to have often dared to be different. The immediate example given is that in an Oklahoma oil camp in the 1930s, he was the only employee who stubbornly refused to cut his lawn at company orders and was nearly fired for it. However, references in the story to Iron Mike's domain, crisp management, and an empire that John D. Rockefeller might have envied do not readily suggest freedom and democracy for anyone but the boss, if for him. A less obvious but no less definite example, when Henry Kissinger became one of Nixon's head coaches as assistant to the president for national security affairs, Time reassured readers that Kissinger is acknowledged by most of his colleagues as a thoroughgoing realist among the often dogmatic band of thinkers known as defense intellectuals. Clearly, both Hayter and Kissinger must be considered different only within the framework of their respective power structures. Time has looked at Ralph Nader in much the same way. A cover story, December 12, 1969, hung on consumerist Nader, among other labels, those of the lonely hero and the peaceful revolutionary, meaning no revolutionary at all, as the context of the term makes clear. Quote, "To many Americans, meaning to Time editors, Nader at 35 has become something of a folk hero, a symbol of constructive protest against the status quo. When this peaceful revolutionary does battle against modern bureaucracies, He uses only the weapons available to any citizen, the law and public opinion. He has never picketed, let alone occupied, a corporate office or public agency. Yet Nader has managed to cut through all the protective layers and achieve results. He has shown that in an increasingly computerized, complex, and impersonal society, one persistent man can actually do something about the forces that often seem to badger him, that he can indeed even shake and change big business, big labor, and even bigger government. End of quote. In short, he is an incarnation of the conscience that Henry Luce felt big business lacked and needed for fulfillment of its potential in the American century. Seeing him as such, and with their nostalgic bias in favor of one-man operations, it was almost inevitable that Time editors should fit him into the bootstrap success story pattern and stress not so much his achievements, though they are reviewed in appropriate detail, as his inspirational effect and the conventionality of his methods. One reply of the alert reader should, of course, be that 1 million Ralph Naders are needed to shake and change big society in a big way, but only a very small handful have his blend of talents. Even as few have whatever it takes to be John D. Rockefeller or Mike Hayter. Another reply might well be that, except for establishment of a consumer's watchdog post at the cabinet level, Nader is reported as advocating no changes in the political structure of the system. In fields more turbulent than manufacturer-consumer relations, the individualism encouraged by Time likewise has turned out a mask for essential conformity to the dominant socioeconomic group. Quote, "It is evident that we can be improved and elevated only just so far and fast as we shall improve and elevate ourselves," end of quote. This statement by Frederick Douglass in 1848 was held up as an inspiration for blacks in the Time essay for December 1st, 1967, Black Power and Black Pride. On the one hand, the Black Power movement was welcomed as a healthy sign despite the separatist element therein. Quote, "The black to fear is the one who has not yet been exposed to the discipline of self-pride," end quote. On the other hand, Whitney Young, Time's favorite black until he died and was succeeded by the Reverend Jesse Jackson, was quoted as saying, "Where the builders differ from the burners is that we want to win victories within the framework of the system." Time lauded the black president of Malcolm X College in Chicago for trying to do exactly that. A good many people seem to agree with the views of civil rights leader Jesse Jackson. The genius of Dr. Hearst, says Jackson, is his ability to turn the urge for rebellion into a quest for knowledge. That's from Time for August 16, 1971. Knowledge within the conventional academic and societal framework, that is. One need not be black to wonder whether the goal of integration into middle-class white society represents the ultimate good for either blacks or whites, especially for the former. Supposing that whites in general learn to accept blacks as equals and as sisters and brothers, if they do, will not such acceptance mean total assimilation of black culture, cultural genocide? There is no lack of humanitarianism in the Time life building. The slanting in the many Time stories about private and public attempts to study or to solve the black-white problem is nearly always sympathetic, if not necessarily optimistic. When this page was first written, the then president of Time Incorporated, James Lennon, was also president of the National Urban League, and the board chairman of Time Incorporated, Andrew Heiskell, was co-chairman of the Urban Coalition, a leading citizens group formed to alleviate slums and unemployment through encouragement of black capitalism. But Time, the magazine, has seemed indifferent to or in favor of the gradual scrubbing, in both senses of the word, of black society. According to the Black Pride essay, the Negro does not want out, he wants in, that is, into white society. The black is learning how to be black rather than a carbon copy white. And the Pride, the new Negro institutions, the black cooperatives, and the black student groups are all testimonials to his new spirit of independence. They will pass as the need for them declines and as the Negro develops the respect for himself that will embolden him to demand the same respect from all of society. That's the words of Time. Surely black respect will be withheld from a white-run magazine that claims to speak for blacks but fails to explain how the black can become anything but a carbon copy white if his organizations disappear and if the Black Power movement is, as suggested at the end of the essay, good only as a temporary phenomenon and as a step toward the truly integrated society that must be the ultimate objective of black and white alike. Time failed to add that in such a society, black culture may have integrated with the Narragansett, the Omaha, the Klamath, and other Native American cultures in common extinction. With Jews and blacks in mind, Time stated on January 31st, 1969, more than a year after the Black Pride essay, that if the U.S. is to be a genuinely pluralistic society, then its goal is not to assimilate minorities, but to let them, within reason, live together, each in its own way. Bravo. Although one should watch for implications of that phrase, within reason. Further, the essay from May 2nd, 1969, 4 months after the comments on genuine pluralism, favorably cited critics who worried whether black studies programs in the universities would only unfit black graduates for the white, that is, the real world. Time also assured readers that, in the long run, the present action phase of black studies is likely to be self-liquidating. As soon as it succeeds, it will not be necessary. Black studies could then grow into a more intellectual discipline like Asian or African area studies. 2 years and 3 months later, the editors had modified their stand enough to praise President Hearst of Malcolm X College for his encouragement of black pride through curriculum in black studies. It's August 16, 1971. In the particular issue about black curricula, the Time people have had at least a plausible argument, but their implicit generalization that black activism, even over the short run, eliminates its own need by virtue of its success and should therefore be regarded as only a passing phase is a discouragement of black militancy, not because it is false, but because it is true, except for the phrase, over the short run. Your militant tactics, Time seems to say to such black readers as it may have accomplished their objectives. You will now make more progress by resorting to more conventional and peaceful means. To white readers, the message is that the blacks will probably do that, get off the streets and resume working through channels that whites have effectively controlled since the end of the Reconstruction era. Is this interpretation uncharitable, not to say over-imaginative? A piece on the effort by the Office of Economic Opportunity to bring civil rights to the Navajo Indians shows how completely the sachems of Time are sealed within their white skins. After tearfully observing that the Navajos clutch the tatters of their treaty promises and watch the old ways die, the editors repeat favorably, the attempt by lawyers from the OEO to subvert the tribal council and to eliminate the crucial right of the tribe to banish unwanted whites from the reservation. In order to acquit charitably the Time editors of conscious hypocrisy, one must censure their failure to understand that for oppressed minorities, overcoming poverty and regaining cultural identity are goals compared to which attaining civil rights in the predominantly legal sense may be a relatively low priority problem. Articles in Time about radicalism on the campus likewise have shown sympathy for nonconformists, but ultimate approval of those who work within the system, regardless of how little effect the latter may have in changing anything. The Time essay for May 18, 1970 lit into Marshall McLuhan for saying that pictures are more important than words, and into Herbert Marcuse, who teaches that protesting words are as empty air in a technological society where power is concentrated in a few hands. Such a contempt for language makes people impatient with the orderly processes of thought. That's Time's words. What bothered the essayist most is that out of such impatience come non-negotiable demands. He should also have been bothered by Marcuse's neat summarizing of the confusion and weakness of the position taken consistently by Time. For instance, the Time essay on The New Radicals, April 28, 1967, closes with, the present new left will undoubtedly fade without producing any middle-aged radicals, many middle-aged radicals, but it will have performed a function. There should always be a new left to drive conventional society to a constant, sometimes painful review of its own values. This paternalistic peroration implies confidence that conventional society, thus goaded, will buy off the radicals with kind treatment and microscopic concessions. It will limit them to the role of gadflies with power to buzz around, but to do nothing else, not even to make anybody listen. Similarly, a cover story on radicals in the class of '68, June 7th, 1968, and a follow-up nearly 3 years later, May 17th, 1971, on the same group of students and former students, found them on both occasions idealistic about the need for social change, but cynical concerning their personal ability to help bring changes about. The slant in both stories was quite sympathetic, and no wonder. In the later story, Time reported that the 6 students are now equally skeptical about changing things through massed protest. In rating the New Left, the blacks, and other dissident groups and individuals, such as Ralph Nader and Saul Alinsky, merely as useful stimuli that liquidate their own threat and function, Time itself has functioned as a self-appointed container corporation. knowingly or unknowingly, functioning to contain dissent, is how the people at Time resolve the contradiction between stress on self-made men from relatively humble origins, like Nader, John Connolly, and Kemmons Wilson, head of the Holiday Inn chain, and the essays amounting to position papers in which emphasis falls on the need for more effective coordination and direction of the economy by the federal government. In these essays, Time comes close to part of the view held by Adolph A. Burl and Gardner C. Means in The Modern Corporation and Private Property, that corporate giants have so much public responsibility that they should be regarded as quasi-public institutions, like schools and hospitals. Quote, the capitalist economy may thus eventually take on some features of socialism, just as socialism over the years has adopted some of the practices of capitalism, according to, end quote, according to Burl and Means. This is paraphrased in Time, August 14th, 1972. It is certainly not in disagreement with Burl and Means. Time isn't, and is just as certainly implying that a society with little room for the career individualist, an individualist that Time nonetheless continues to romanticize, and perhaps too with little room for powerful but irresponsible private news magazines. The aerospace program has afforded Time a special opportunity for eliminating individual freedom and democracy in such a way as to make many individuals feel good. Time proclaimed that the Apollo 8 project of orbiting the moon and returning the three-man capsule safely to Earth demanded the creativity and dedication of the greatest task force ever assembled for a peaceful purpose. 300,000 engineers, technicians, and workers, 22,000 contractors, backed by $833 billion spent on the nation's space effort in the past decade. However, the major focus, excuse me, the major focus in Time stories about the Apollo moonshots was on the few astronauts for whom all this effort and capital was expended. The courage of these men, their self-discipline, and their role as pioneers in space were properly stressed. But Time also made clear that the role in each case was earned through a lifetime of dedication to the military and technical establishment and through years of arduous, single-minded training. It was also clear that the average reader, and even the average flyer or military man, could not hope to be such a hero. His participation must either be wholly vicarious or limited to that of obscure worker in one of the many technical or industrial specialties that indirectly helped make the moon flights possible. Hard though the job might seem, Time pretty well succeeded in depersonalizing the astronauts. The magazine was helped by the selection policy of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which allegedly chose its pioneers in part for publicity purposes and made sure that all possible space voyagers would function when on the ground within conventional American backdrops. Admittedly, the chosen few had to fulfill many other qualifications. The same men might have been picked even had their public images not been considered. Reduction of a hero to just one of the folks is less difficult if he is a one-career man with a stable family life, membership in one of the bigger churches, and one or two voluntary posts of civic responsibility, like, for example, secretary-treasurer of one's neighborhood property owners association. Consequently, of the astronauts in the manned Apollo space capsules, only Walter Schirra acquired in Time, as distinct from life, no pun intended, a personality commensurate with his achievements, complex, intriguing, and with a sense of irony despite his dedication. Even so, in presenting him, Time made an unnecessary exaggeration. By now, everyone who has worked with him is convinced that there are really two Wally Schirras. If they were right, NASA had a schizophrenic on board one of their capsules. And who or what is meant by everyone? Did Time reporters really consult every one of those dozens of people? Anyway, then came details about Schirra's whims during the Apollo 7 flight, and that paragraph was followed by, this is a quote, "The other Wally Schirra is a meticulous test pilot and engineer. He is an iron-spined Navy captain who has never hesitated to sound off when he is displeased. Early in the space program, he openly criticized John Glenn's NASA-sponsored public relations tours and argued that they had effectively removed Glenn from the program. When it was rumored that NASA might deny Gordon Cooper a Mercury orbital flight, Wally rescued Cooper by threatening to take the issue to the press." End of quote. Time didn't do badly here. despite the cliche iron-spined two aspects of Seurat's personality, devotion to duty as he interpreted it, and independence of will, come across as a paradoxical but believable combination of character traits. Of course, Time likes to focus on the leader or top performer in any production, and in the same story, the magazine smoothly brushed off Walter Cunningham and Don Isley with, all three stars of the Wally, Walt, and Don show shared equal billing, but each performance, like the flight itself, really belonged to the spacecraft commander, Wally Schirra. In treating the personnel of the Apollo 8 orbital flight, Time turned to Democratic to the extent of making Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders virtually indistinguishable in all important respects, except for one photograph, the caption of which mentions that Anders was a rookie. A prominent aspect of the same story was a set of 3 photos, one of each astronaut and his family, stair-stepped across the page, another set of 3 decorated an earlier issue. All of these pictures looked depressingly like most posed group shots for the family album. Weak attempts were made to differentiate the astronauts of Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 through catchphrases. A set of profiles of the Apollo 11 astronauts was entitled "The Crew, Men Apart." Neil Armstrong, skipper of Apollo 11, was called an inscrutable loner. His crewmate, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, was tabbed a devoted team player, but also very much his own man. And the third crewman, Mike Collins, was labeled relaxed and easygoing. But even this reflex-level pigeonholing in the text was nullified by another set of family photos that, as far as the casual viewer was concerned, and most viewers of Time photos are casual, including some who read the text carefully, could just as well have been mutually interchanged with the family shots of Anders, Borman, and Lovell. Few would have noticed the difference. Treatment of the Apollo 12 expedition was much briefer than that of earlier flights, in fact, anticlimactic. And in spite of some emphasis on the sense of humor displayed by skipper Charles Pete Conrad and a box giving one paragraph microbiographies of Conrad and of crewmates Richard F. Gordon and Alan L. Bean, Time again managed to reduce the crew to colorless normality. Conrad was pigeonholed thus: he is an inveterate joke-teller, likes to whistle through the gap between his front teeth, and listens for hours to country and western music. In the narrative of how the intrepid travelers approached the moon, landed, and began their exploration on foot, Time managed to make Conrad and Bean look like amiable bumblers. As they wriggled into their life support packs, they sounded like a vaudeville team changing costumes in a phone booth. Conrad giggled, cackled, whistled through the gap in his front teeth, laughed repeatedly, and filled the airwaves with ho-ho-hos, dum-de-dum-dums, cackles, and other sounds of pure enjoyment. Both men collected rock samples with the enthusiasm of tenderfoot Boy Scouts. And when a TV camera went out, Bean, like any other 20th century man confronted by the perversity of non-functioning machines, whacked it with his hammer. This trifling incident was singled out, given the subhead Lunar Atavism, and placed as the lead item in American Notes, and therefore in the lead in the magazine as a whole, November 28, 1969. The main story on the moon flight did not begin until page 24. Buried in page 27 was a tamer version of Bean's action. In exasperation, he finally tapped it with a hammer. In addition, Time stated that on television, the Apollo 8 crew, in contrast with the men of Apollo 7, seemed as staid and businesslike as a group of corporate executives. This was no doubt meant as a lukewarm compliment, but the subsequent portraits of Borman, Lovell, and Anders as deadly serious men, cool under pressure and addicted to speech filled with space jargon, and as law-abiding citizens austerely dedicated to the space program, unfairly turned them into rather dull fellows. In the cases of the Apollo 10 crew, Tom Stafford, Eugene Cernan, John Young, the Apollo 12 group, Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, and of the Apollo 13 crew, Lovell, Fred W. Hayes Jr., John L. Swigert Jr., the effort to depersonalize seemed overt. Reference was made to the earthy language of Stafford, Cernan, and Young, and to Armstrong's super cool, all-American image. Armstrong habitually looked as though he had just stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, hardly the place for a loner. Aldrin was a hard-driving perfectionist, weren't all the astronauts? Collins, when off duty, went out of his way to slop around in jeans and act as unmilitary as possible. Hayes was a devoted family man, whereas his crewmate, John Swigert Jr., was a not-so-secret swinger with the reputation of having a girl in every port, every airport. And now that we've scanned these catchphrases, what have we really learned about the astronauts? The most individualizing detail presented concerning any of them is essentially another cliche, namely Aldrin's admission that possibly they have all been somewhat dehumanized by what he calls the treadmill of the space program. Naturally, the astronauts are not responsible for their images in time, but time is responsible for the implied contradiction that the space pioneers are a technological elite and yet in many ways are just ordinary Joes. Whatever the extent to which the second proposition may be true, the plain folks treatment blurs the actual putting down of the individual citizen in general, for whom, supposedly, all this technological and social network of the space program and of American society itself exists. Yet, put down he is, except for the space voyaging elite. Except for the space voyaging elite, the organization is everything or nearly everything. The complexity, vastness, and unity of NASA are played up. The few astronauts are given antiseptic treatment, and in spite of those 300,000 engineers, technicians, and workers, the general impression is created that NASA consists mainly of astronauts, administrators, and a few master technicians. The pieces about the Apollo 7 and 8 expeditions in 8 issues of Time included 12 citations of top NASA officials, 3 of rank and filers, and 2 of uncategorized personnel. One of the officials, George Low, manager of the Apollo program, rated a boxed feature entitled The Groundling Who Won, January 3, 1969, which was tailored to the same length as another story on page 16 about a crucial power plant in Apollo 8, the little engine that could. In earlier weeks, this engine had been referred to as large and as powerful. Evidently, Time suddenly shrank it to give it a degree of personalization elsewhere granted only to Low and the astronauts, their bosses, and super technicians like the Masters of Mission Control, the 2 flight directors who guided home the crippled Apollo 13. In fact, machines were given priority over men in most of the moon stories, despite a claim that Apollo 14 proved how, for the time being at least, man as a lunar explorer is still superior to a machine. And also despite, maybe because of, the emphasis on how few were the actual space pioneers. In other pieces about scientific developments, Time often reverses its usual procedure and quite properly stresses the scientific or technical material rather than the individuals involved. But perhaps because the space program was so vast and complex, the profusion of technological details in the moon stories was sometimes oppressive, despite the adroitness with which some of those details were translated into Time's style. The fine talk about man, the flights were a journey into man's future, was even more oppressive. Men, individuals, persons, as contrasted to man, have counted for little in the electronic utopia of Time. The essay for January 3rd, 1969, the week after the first orbiting of the moon, was especially explicit and ominous. Lumping students and militants, black and white, neophyte radicals and new leftists as would-be revolutionaries with no program for the future, this editorial implied without irony that the orbiting of the moon, an establishment venture, was the only recent event to which, in the devalued coinage of the language, the word revolutionary might still be appropriate, because it showed, more than any event since the discovery of the New World, that Western man could conquer the social evils of Earth and bring about a utopian tomorrow. From shaky logic, the essayist launched into rhapsody. For this is what westernized man can do. He will not turn into a passive contemplative being. He will not drop out and turn off. He will not seek stability and inner peace in the quest for nirvana. Western man is Faust, and if he knows anything at all, he knows how to challenge nature, how to dare against dangerous odds, and even against reason, end quote. Having thus written off a good many Western men, including some of the theoreticians who made space science possible, the essay went on to leave no doubt about which side Time was on. Quote, "It is possible to look at the moon flight and shudder at the vast, impersonal, computerized army of interchangeable technicians who brought it about. It is also possible to see in this endeavor the crucial gifts for organization and cooperation that alone will make survival in the post-industrial age feasible. It is possible to look at the moon flight and be dismayed at the crass expenditure of money, sweat, and time, the sheer materialist effort, the ultimate triumph of gadgetry, the unabashed hubris of technique. But it is also possible to see in it the genius that is providing the abundance to end poverty, and the order and precision that may yet bring peace, or at least bring it somewhat nearer, end quote. Throughout, the essayist ignored the repeated indication in other time stories that Apollo 8 is not primarily a scientific flight, but a race with the Russians. Nor did he consider that, however revolutionary the Apollo missions, as depicted by Time, might appear in a technological way, as a successful project of big government, big technology, and big business, their social influence had to be, in the most exact sense of the term, counter-revolutionary. The missions have extended the scope and enhanced the prestige of the power structure, making key men less likely to care about changing the status quo and throwing more difficulties, as that editorial actually implies, in the way of rebels and dissenters. But one should not argue with a hymn, even if it is in prose and is labeled an essay. After men had reached the moon, another incantatory essay, July 25th, 1969, proclaimed that individual valor can be preserved in a collective age. Patronizingly, the celebrant dismissed the thoughtful skeptics who suggested that the superorganized voyage of the spacecraft rendered lone individual courage passé, and refuted many of today's young to whom the astronauts do not seem particularly heroic precisely because they epitomize the organization man, end quote. The writer's method of refutation was simply categorical denial. Despite the moonshot's vast supportive forces, the astronauts themselves are essentially loners. Before they take off, they have no guarantees of success, let alone survival. Airborne, they can only be aided so far. After that, like the very earliest adventurers, they are on their own. End of that quote. A lengthy chapter would be required to shoot proper holes in all the fallacies and oversimplifications of this paragraph. Suffice that the reference to the spacemen as loners contradicts many columns of text in Time, including several in that same issue. That the last sentence alone must have irked planners, builders, and maintainers of the elaborate ground control system, even if they admitted the kernel of truth in the statement, and that the claim to have read the minds of today's youth was naive at best, glib and arrogant at worst. In the news stories about the moonshots, as well as in the essays, the degree of opinion has often risen or sunk to the incantatory level. Quote, man is propelled from Earth to moon by the same instincts that led him from cave to college, the lonely search for knowledge, the fascination of attacking the impregnable, the creative impulse shared with Tennyson's Ulysses to seek a newer world, to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars. End of that quote, and none too soon. Also, another quote, it all comes down to this. Man long ago picked the moon as a goal, and there is no turning back, end quote. The latter passage is a variation of the bromide that you can't fight progress, and it bypasses the issue, as do other sonorities. Probably very few people now doubt the ultimate value of space exploration. The real question is, how fast should it be pushed at the expense of socially constructive domestic programs? On this point, Time's position was not clear until after Apollo 13 limped home in April 1970. Time then reluctantly conceded that ecology, poverty, and the national budget should perhaps have equal or higher priority than the space contest. But the contradictory attitude toward the individual's freedom in connection with spaceflight and with much else remains pervasive in the magazine. One sees the contradiction in a recent issue, the issue for June 21st of this year, in the cover picture. And in the cover picture, the faces of presidential candidates Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan are presented in mutually close proximity and colored with the same florid flesh tints. The effect is to suggest likeness, similarity. By contrast, the text of the set of cover stories within the magazine sharply differentiates among the three characters. One sees the contradiction again in the obituary piece on Martha Mitchell, June 14th of this year, which grabs the reader with the headline, Martha was right, and begins with emphasis on how she glittered in the drab Nixonian setting where to glow was considered a no-no. Details of her colorful nonconformity are given with zest. However, buried in the middle of the story is the reservation that, as long as she remained ardently pro-Nixon, Martha's peccadillos were tolerated. The last paragraph depicts how, as Watergate unraveled, Martha's world fell apart, and how, just before her death, she was allegedly without funds and without friends. The story ends with, at her funeral, a floral offering bore the words, "Martha was right," and of course she was. She had paid a high price for being so. That final statement tips the emotional balance of the story cautiously toward prudence and conformity. Though Henry Luce has been dead for 9 years, the contradictory attitude toward freedom and necessity just discussed somewhat resembles the Calvinistic view of man that inspired Luce throughout his career. According to Calvin, all events were predestined by Jehovah. Man was free merely to obey the Lord's will. There was no way he could disobey it. Substitute progress, or a time euphemism such as upward instinct, the Faustian impulse, or spiritual and intellectual challenges for deity, and the Presbyterian Calvinism of Luce is replaced by a secular counterpart. An optimistic, godless, quasi-predestinarianism, not wildly different from one tenet of so-called godless communism. According to the new predestinarianism, the more one learns about the laws of progress, the more free one is to obey them. According to Frederick Engels, with the coming of socialism, the stage preliminary to communism, man will at least understand the whys and wherefores of his historical situation. Quote, "The laws of his social action, hitherto standing face to face with man as laws of nature, foreign to and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding and thereby mastered by him." End of quote. In one view, Jehovah has been displaced by progress or destiny, in the other by the laws of social action. In both cases, one result of the application of these theories has been the welfare warfare superstate in which the mass communications media, be they public or private, foster the illusion that dissent is effective and simultaneously stroke the reader or viewer into a mood of conformity. On a large scale? Any particular dissent you have in mind?
Well, I mean, the dissent that goes through, I suppose the only dissent that we have here is the dissent that goes through channels, isn't it?
I know
Are you equating dissent with revolution?
No. And neither is the magazine.
Time any more guilty, do you think, Norris, of distorting public opinion, and you think argue than, say, Newsweek?
Oh no, they're merely more conspicuous. They were the prototype of other news magazines and remain the largest in circulation and I should imagine, most influential.
This is pretty subjective, Norris, but it seems to me that Newsweek and Time, both in their attitudes and in their diction and their use of metaphor, for example, have grown closer and closer together.
Well, that's more because time is toning down.
Yeah,
and sprucing up.
I think maybe there's a little sprucing up, maybe it's just contrast.
Every time that I think time is toning down, then I run into some other example of cutesy phraseology.
Well, who's the editor now? Is he a tutor? Tutor of Luce?
Oh yes, Henry Anatole Grunwald started as a copy boy, as they remind us every few issues in the letter from the publisher, worked his way up through the ranks of the organization.
I missed the first part, so I'm maybe said something like this. I almost get the impression you see Time magazine as being something like a mass media version of John D. McDonald book. I mean, very superficial, very full of interesting use of the language, but not last step. Is that your trust?
Well, yes, and and this is true of news magazines in general. It's well, a limitation that's built into the medium. I probably sound unduly critical of Time as such. But they're simply my model for delineating the limits of the news magazine medium. The limitations of course, of TV news media are even more severe in that respect. But one could take the vocabulary of literary criticism as used in criticism of fiction and apply it very advantageously to time, and point out their use of balance and antithesis, of crisis and complications, suspense, climax. The news is recreated by them. It's not reported.
Isn't that true of all news media?
Yeah.
My God, news has got to be shaped to be news, doesn't it?
Certainly does. But readers need to be reminded of this, especially when you see the word report appearing over and over again.
Yeah. Doesn't seem to be any way out of that, though. I mean, that's just part of attracting the public to buy the medium.
Yes, it should not be forgotten that the manufacture of news is a business, and the media are essentially factories that have to manufacture and attractively package a product for profit.
What about the columnists? Do they strive for a balance of points of view in their columns like Newsweek does occasionally?
Time does not use columnists, except within the last, with Hugh Sidey as an exception over a number of years. Recently they've added one more. They've added a column by Thomas Griffith, so they may be going Newsweek's way. That's a very recent development.
Well, time comforts me when I can read this week of Hugh Sidey sitting in the Oval Office. And you seen this week's issue?
No, I haven't.
It's nice. You get a nice warm appraisal of the other occupant of the Oval Office.
My copy was 2 days late this week. Maybe they knew sometime. Yes, they project. This has been a code encouraged by Luce and Haddon from the beginning. It's important to give the reader the "you are there" feeling.
Yeah.
Get the picture of what the wood of the desk looks like, and the sheen of the sunlight on the glass, and what brand of cigarettes the dignitary is smoking, etc.
And what Mr. Dulles ate for lunch is more important than any idea he might have, or any policy he might propose.
Do they make any comment on Woodward and Bernstein, what they think of them, and what kind of journalism they think that is?
Yes, they thought, they think they're great. They wrote the only really glowingly favorable review of the Final Days that I've seen. And I haven't yet seen the Final Days, but I suspect it may be written in, may have a good deal of time style in it.
Newsweek got an interesting comment on the movie. Jack Crow talked about he said that the movie, All President's Men, as well as the novel, points out that the real reality, he uses the word true reality of Watergate is in the reporting, not in the event itself. And it's interesting, and he would use the phrase true reality is in the reporting of the thing, than the fact that the newsmen became heroes.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to point out in addition that this "you are there" approach to the reader, this emphasis on the sensory details that bring you up close, is part of this overall split in their thinking. They try to make the reader feel like he's somebody, like an individual, like he's a real individual, and right there on the scene. Whereas the general drift of their message is usually the impressiveness of and vastness of the establishment and the need to fit into your particular corporate niche. The individual is really nothing, except as a consumer of news media.
Or the niche filler. I mean, you can drive your individuality from your niche filling capacities. It takes some strength, I guess.
Do you think general news magazines might go the way of some of the other general magazines which look alike? And would you look ahead to the generation in 10 years?
I have no data that would enable me to make any sort of prediction beyond a guess, which is no better than anybody else's. Who knows? there's been a tendency in all of the news magazines toward fewer and longer, more in-depth articles, trying to do the things that the TV media cannot do. And this may have been able to survive, I don't know. The financial situation, at least the last piece I saw anywhere on it of Times, seemed to be very stable. They've had ups and downs, but they've been a steadily profit-making corporation for all these men. They were able to absorb a $24 million loss of Sports Illustrated in its first 5 years until Sports Illustrated finally turned the corner.
Well, is Time owned by a conglomerate now too?
Time Life Incorporated, yes, which owns Sports Illustrated, Money, People, and about 500,000 acres of pulp and paper timberland in Texas, a big paper-making complex called East Tex Corporation, and a big chain of cable TV franchises, including, I think, the one for Manhattan. That picture changes. They buy and sell in and out of other parts of the media so frequently that it's hard to keep track. They also have TV interests in a number of other countries. As of 2 years ago, they owned a half interest in the only English language station in Hong Kong, and therefore were able to control the programming. But they had stations in Uruguay, Argentina, Central America, and they also own 25 or 30 suburban newspapers. For a while, they were buying up all of the newspapers around Chicago. They had a ring of 28 suburban newspapers. They sold off about half of those to McGraw-Hill. And within the last few months, who knows what they've been done. It's a conglomerate, yes.
Any explanation for that saturation technique in Chicago?
None whatsoever.
Some odd.
Well, how's their circulation? Is it holding steady, dropping, growing, and all that?
Been holding steady at about 7.5 million. Increasing very slightly. They don't want it to increase fast. The economics of publishing our magazines are fantastic and seem to break all the rules. The more subscribers, the more costly each subscriber is. The more costly the magazine becomes per subscriber, for reasons that are not clear at all to me. The Saturday Evening Post died partly because they couldn't keep their number of subscribers down. Their expenses had got to the point where it was costing more to get a magazine into each subscriber's mailbox. And so they drastically told about 2 million subscribers to forget it, and they would refund their money for that year. And it still didn't help.
Was that something to do with the cost of newsprint?
Newsprint, printing, changing technology, raising second and third class mailing rates, probably a host of other factors.
Do you see this kind of journalism separate and distinct from newspaper journalism? Do you see this Time being a leader, national leader, and drift? Or do you see the newspapers like the New York Times, Washington Post, etc.?
I don't know what to think. They're all powerful influences. There's no way you can quantitatively measure the influence of one over another. When you get into the whole field of the interaction between the media and the public, mostly you're going on hunches and guesswork, because there's no way of quantifying enough material to give you any firm basis for predictions.
They got Nielsen ratings.
Yes, that applies to a very limited sector of media operations, however. How would you get a Nielsen rating for Time or for the Washington Post?
Well, subscription fees.
We're talking about influence.
Yeah.
We don't even know how many readers per issue the Washington Post has, or Time has, or for that matter, the Atlantic Monthly. Estimates range anywhere from 3 to 10 for Time. Readers per issue, as it passes around. And that doesn't tell you anything about how much of any issue someone reads. We make common sense guesses that people read headlines. I've seen an attempt in one journalism text to quantify that, to say that for every 12 persons who reads a headline in a certain size type, maybe one will read to the bottom of the story if it extends the full length of the page. Now, on what basis do they get a figure like that? The conditions under which a reader reads it are going to have something to say about that, too. The reader's got a couple of kids squalling at his elbow, he's not so likely to read all the way down. We assume that pictures grab a lot more eyes than text does. We assume that headlines grab a lot more eyes than text does, but maybe not so many as pictures. We could be wrong there. You can tell what the editors assume by their makeup. You can assume that Time places a very high value on pictures, and especially on arrangements. Stair-stepping of pictures, or using pictures with captions that go in a parallel series. And we assume also that a lot more people browse through a magazine than read it carefully. We assume also that a lot of people may read one or two departments carefully in their special interests. But who's to say to what degree these assumptions are correct? Well, we can tell what the editors are assuming by the way they lay out the magazine, and also, of course, by the contents.
What about the writers at the time? Are you aware of any style or thematic injunctions given to the writers at the time?
I have no behind-the-scenes information whatsoever. I am aware of a moderate trend toward away from the anonymity insisted on by Luce. More often, within the last few years, they will specify what reporters they've had on the scene of a certain story. For instance, they'll say, Middle East Bureau Chief Karsten Prager, I think it is, and his assistant Wilton Wynn traveled between the lines in Beirut. Their report. There's that misleading word report again. What it doesn't say, of course, is that the report is heavily edited back home. And I do mean heavily. They may write, according to Time staffers themselves in books about the magazine, only a fraction of the original wordage used may actually appear in the magazine. And the correspondents often complain about that, too.
Well, do they have rewrite men then that rewrite the material?
Oh, yes. There's a series of researchers and rewriters, and a controversial story can go right on up to the editor-in-chief.
They make a book out of the magazine instead of a bunch of stories.
Right.
I've read that there was a coverage of 72, 70, and 68 Clinton campaigns. Whoever the Time-Life man was, only what, the 1 to 5% of his copy, and that's in terms of quantity, was in the magazine.
No,
But he was filing story-length reports, with 5-10 pages every day. And out of that they compile something, and even what they put in, very little of it was what he had actually written. It had been so processed, it looked like a term paper third time around.
That sounds reasonable, reliable. Harmonizes with the information that I have. So that the trend toward bylines does not mean a great deal. Moreover, it's often not clear when they give a little head note specifying that this or that correspondent is tendering this or that report. Sometimes it's not clear from the structure of the story how much of it is that individual's own words, and how much written by the staff back home. Sometimes a reporter will be mentioned within the text of a story, quoted briefly, and then 2 or 3 paragraphs will follow, which may or may not, which will not be enclosed in quotes, and which may or may not represent a summary of his views. So that, as I say, the trend away from anonymity does not really contribute very much toward letting the reader evaluate the credibility of his stories.
Well, can you tell much about them too by the types of books and films that they review? Or does it give you any indication as to their motives or?
Well, I don't think they have any special secret motives. As I say, I think they have this basic confusion between nostalgic individualism and infatuation with the giant superstate. No, I can't find any pattern in their selection of material for review. But I do find consistent emphasis in the back of the book, as they call it, on the material success of as measured, you know, in the copies sold and dollars brought in of the films, books, and plays that they reviewed.
It seems to me, anyway, I don't read Time, I read Newsweek, but it seems to me if you're a political figure, political or literary figure of this century, you write some memoirs, you're going to inevitably be reviewed by one of those. And just what gives them a chance to show up or speculate about the causes of success, maybe, or tie in with the leading events of the age or something like that.
Well, if anyone becomes a big name, that is, a manuscript, a book like the published manuscript, original manuscript of Eliot's The Wasteland was reviewed because Eliot has become a big name in letters. But no, being a politician, there's no guarantee that you'll be reviewed by the news magazines unless there's some ulterior reason, unless it's a name or unless it's figured in a big scandal or unless they've got, you know, something else that they figure is good copy.
They review Agnew's book? No.
Pardon?
Have they reviewed Agnew's novel, The Candle of the Book?
Not yet. So they reviewed Ehrlichman's novel. Yeah, they didn't think much of it.
And this is Newsweek, or I'm going to give a couple of paragraphs there, it's very short.
They didn't think much of Ehrlichman's, either as expose or as fiction. I'm sure they'll get around to Agnew's in the next week or two. It's become a joke, really, on how much Newsweek and Time resemble each other in the selection and emphasis of their news. One topic or figure was a cover story in one that was almost certain to be the cover story of the other, if not that week, the next. And the top editors of both heatedly deny any collaboration, and I'm sure that they're sincere. Minds think alike.
Was there one week recently where both featured on the cover some rock or pop singer who was virtually unknown to at least a lot of people?
I believe so. Springsteen.
Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen.
The only person who's been a Time worker that I know is somebody at Iowa City who's been a proofreader for a number of years. She said that there's always pressure from the business office to have more entertainment figures on the cover because they sell hundreds of thousands of newsstand copies. Whereas tycoons and political figures sell cover stories featuring capitalists or scientists do not. I don't doubt that. At least the cover on Paul McCartney sold a great deal.
Comment about the connection between the government and the news magazines. Do you think one favors the other, one works with the other to a great extent? More so than other mass media?
Now, this is more so than the other mass media, I couldn't say. Life is too short. I simply cannot try to qualify as any kind of an expert in the visual media to the extent that I've studied news magazines. But this is part of that basic self-deception, I think. They see themselves, I think, they say so often enough, meaning the news media, as standing in an adversary relationship, primarily, to the government. But I see them as promoting the bigness of government, the complexity of government itself. They may disagree with specific programs, as over-budgeted or corrupt, wasteful, inefficient, etc., scandal-ridden, but they approve of the big establishment as a whole, and encourage reader participation in it. Whole reason for the entertaining back of the book cultural section, so-called, is to keep the reader from being too bored in his participation, to titillating with what's going on in the artistic world and in the underground. Now they'll have news not only from fashions, but also the latest fad in what the counterculture is doing in a department like Modern Living. But they honestly see themselves as in an adversary relationship, and of course sometimes they function as such. Their image is particularly good now after Watergate, where they had a situation in which they had a wide open opportunity to do one of their proper jobs. But along with that, they essentially promote the bigness of government as well as the bigness of industry. Their position, as I say, is very much like Burrell and Means, that corporations are, or at least ought to be, and ought to consider themselves quasi-public institutions. They're still supposed to go on taking profits, but they're supposed to have a responsibility, and so they approve, although they have landed on Nader for making mistakes, they didn't approve of his investigating banking. They thought that he overdid it there, because people didn't know much about banking. As I said, I think Nader is great for helping keep businessmen honest. And they're intrigued by old-style operators like Howard Hughes. Their cover on Hughes was a real memento mori kind of thing. Here, Howard, very fascinating on the colorful details and his one-man achievements and exploits, and also the spectacular nature of some of these mistakes. But coming down to it, where is he now? The old, in death he's no better than all the rest of you. The implied message is, be happy where you are. But this last, we issued before this last one, had their essay was on the primary system, which they say it's messy, but it works. And the primary system is certainly part of one big sprawling, mazy part of government.
But what about foreign policy? How do they stem on that? I mean, say the Italian election. I remember when Allende got into Chile, there was a big cover, red cover on a time that said Marxist threats in Chile,
Yeah.
the hammer and sickle.
I drag that out of every 205 class. Because their cover is usually an important propaganda vehicle. Well, as to foreign policy, they've had to pull back the biggest change made in their post-Lucian period is that they don't expect America to dominate the world anymore economically, but they've got sectors pretty clearly marked out. They feel that we can live with the third world. We can't dominate them politically, but that we should be able to dominate them economically eventually. Large investments, and by encouraging governments that will encourage the climate for large investments. No basic change, a change in details. They feel, well, there have to be more consortiums with the British, French, Dutch than there used to be. They don't talk so much about, and the Japanese, they don't talk so much about the American, the investment of Kennecott Copper in Peru, or Esso Standard in India, like we used to. They've had to accommodate. But they still feel that I put this together from scattered observations collected over systematically, week by week, that the role of the U.S. is still